The forest was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of dawn, but the kind that felt watched. Sergeant Daniel Mercer noticed it first. No birds, no wind in the branches, not even the distant rumble of artillery that had followed them for days. Just stillness. The patrol stopped without anyone giving an order. 6 men stood among the wet pine trees, listening to a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. Then they heard it. Boots. Not one pair. Many. Somewhere beyond the fog, metal brushed against metal, followed by a low voice speaking German. Mercer slowly lowered himself behind a fallen trunk, raising a hand to keep the others from moving. The patrol had crossed farther than the maps allowed. The line between friendly and enemy territory had disappeared hours ago, and now the enemy had found it first. The ambush did not begin with gunfire. It began with realization. Shapes moved between the trees, helmets, rifles, shadows circling wider and wider. The patrol wasn't being attacked. They were being contained. Whoever commanded the German unit was patient. They weren't rushing. They were tightening a ring. Mercer understood before anyone else. They weren't surrounded by accident. They had been hunted, and within minutes the men beside him, men he had marched with since Normandy, would either break the line or vanish into the forest forever. War is often remembered through maps and dates, arrows drawn across Europe, cities taken and lost, battles given names that sound almost distant. But none of those maps show what it felt like to stand in a forest and realize that every direction led to the enemy. In October of 1944, Allied forces were pushing deeper into occupied territory, and patrols were constantly sent ahead of the main advance. Their job was simple on paper: move forward, observe, report, and return. No glory, no medals, just information. Yet these small patrols often faced the greatest danger because they walked into places no army fully controlled. Sergeant Daniel Mercer's patrol was one of those units. 6 soldiers moved through unfamiliar woodland under low clouds and freezing mist. Their radios worked only half the time, their maps were outdated, and the front line shifted by the hour. Still, none of them expected what would happen that morning. Not a battle, not a firefight, but a situation far worse. They would not be fighting to win territory. They would be fighting simply to remain alive. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. I always find it incredible how stories from a war fought decades ago still reach people all over the world today. And if you enjoy realistic, story-driven WWII narratives, consider subscribing to the channel. More stories like this are coming. Stories about moments history barely recorded, but the soldiers never forgot. Now, let's go back to the forest. And to the moment, Sergeant Mercer realized the patrol was no longer alone. Mercer did not look at the men behind him. He kept his eyes on the fog drifting between the trees. Experience had taught him that fear spread fastest when soldiers watched each other instead of the terrain. If one man panicked, the others would follow. So he stayed still, breathing slowly, counting the seconds between the distant German voices. Private Ellison lay to his right, barely 20 years old, gripping his rifle so tightly his hands trembled. The sound of cloth brushing bark made Mercer glance sideways. The boy was shaking not from cold, but from the awareness settling in. They were not scouting anymore. They were prey. Another voice echoed closer now, a command. The patrol could not understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Coordination. Whoever surrounded them knew exactly how many men they were facing and where they were positioned. This was no accidental encounter. A German unit had tracked their footprints through the damp ground. Mercer leaned back just enough for his whisper to reach the others. "Do not fire unless I say." Corporal Hayes slowly crawled nearer, his face streaked with mud. "Sarge, they're moving around us." Mercer already knew. The forest itself revealed it. Branches snapped at measured intervals, leaves shifted where no wind moved them, a tightening arc. The Germans were closing gaps, sealing escape routes. They wanted the patrol contained, not scattered. Capturing prisoners meant intelligence, and intelligence meant advantage. He began mapping the enemy positions in his mind. Sound to the east, movement to the south, silence to the north, and silence was the most dangerous direction of all. A path left quiet was often the one being watched most carefully. Then came the shot. One single rifle crack shattered the stillness. Private Ellison jerked beside him, gasping. A round struck the trunk inches above Mercer's shoulder, splintering bark across his helmet. The Germans had not missed by accident. It was a warning shot, proof they could fire whenever they wished. They wanted the patrol to panic. Hayes nearly returned fire, but Mercer grabbed his sleeve hard enough to stop him. Not yet! If they fired blindly, they would reveal every position. The patrol would last seconds. Mercer forced himself to think beyond instinct. The Germans were patient. That meant they had numbers. The patrol had 6 rifles, limited ammunition, and no reliable radio contact. Fighting in place meant certain death. Running without direction meant being shot in the open. The only option left was movement with purpose. He slowly turned to the men. "We break west." It sounded simple, but it was the most dangerous direction. A shallow depression filled with dense undergrowth. Hard to move through, harder to see through. That also meant harder to aim through. The Germans would have difficulty maintaining formation there. Hayes understood immediately. "They'll chase," Mercer nodded. "Yes, but chasing men are not surrounding men." He waited. The German footsteps paused again, closer now, perhaps 20 meters. A branch moved ahead, revealing a helmet for half a second before disappearing. They were nearly inside rifle range. Mercer counted silently. 3, 2, 1. Move! The patrol burst from cover in a coordinated sprint. Leaves tore beneath their boots as they forced through brush. Gunfire erupted instantly, bullets slicing through branches overhead, dirt kicked up beside them. The Germans had expected hesitation, not a sudden breakout. Ellison stumbled, but Mercer shoved him forward. There was no formation now, only direction. The forest floor sloped downward, forcing them into faster movement than planned. Shouts in German followed behind, louder now, urgent. They were no longer hunting, they were pursuing. Mercer did not slow. He knew the next 30 seconds would decide survival. The first reaction of any surrounding force was to close the ring again ahead of fleeing targets. Somewhere in front of them, another German element would already be moving to intercept. And then, he saw it. The ground ended. The depression opened into a narrow ravine, deeper than expected, its sides steep and slick with wet soil. A small stream cut through its base. Not on the map, not reported, a natural barrier. The patrol skidded to the edge. Behind them branches snapped rapidly, the enemy closing fast. For a brief moment, every man looked at Mercer. He realized the truth immediately. They had escaped the circle, only to reach a trap the forest itself had built. And the Germans were still coming. The ravine was deeper than it first appeared. From the edge, Mercer could not see the bottom clearly, only dark water moving slowly between rocks and a steep descent of mud and exposed roots. The slope was not vertical, but it was treacherous. A wrong step would send a man sliding uncontrollably. Behind them, the Germans were close enough now that individual footsteps could be distinguished from one another. The patrol had seconds, not minutes. "Down," Mercer ordered. Hayes hesitated. "Sarge, we won't climb back up." "I know." There was no alternative. Remaining at the top meant being fired upon from multiple angles. The ravine at least blocked direct line of sight and forced the enemy to approach in single file. It turned numbers into a disadvantage, temporarily. Mercer slid first. He lowered himself over the edge, boots digging into wet soil. The ground gave way almost immediately, and he half fell, half controlled his descent, grabbing roots and stones to slow his fall. Mud soaked his uniform by the time he reached the bottom. The others followed, some more successfully than others. Ellison lost footing midway and slid hard, landing beside Mercer in the shallow stream with a painful splash. He stifled a cry, clutching his ankle but still moving, when Mercer pulled him behind a rock formation. Gunfire snapped above them. Rifle rounds struck the ridgeline, but the angle prevented accurate targeting. The Germans had reached the edge, but could not immediately fire downward without exposing themselves. For the first time since the forest encounter began, the patrol had a momentary shield. Mercer used it. Positions. Spread 10 feet apart. Watch both sides. The ravine narrowed ahead, curving slightly westward. Dense brush and fallen timber blocked direct movement, forcing slow travel. Perfect terrain for ambush from either side. Hayes crouched beside a boulder, scanning upward. "They'll come down." "Yes," Mercer said quietly, "but not all at once." He knew how trained units behaved. The Germans would send 2 or 3 men first to secure the descent, then others after. If the patrol could stop the first group, they might buy time. A helmet appeared at the ridge. Mercer did not fire yet. The soldier cautiously tested footing, lowering himself halfway. A second followed behind him, providing cover. They were careful, disciplined, not reckless. Mercer waited until both were committed to the slope. Then he fired. The first German lost grip instantly, sliding downward and striking rocks before reaching the stream. The second tried to climb back, but Hayes's shot forced him to release, tumbling into the ravine as well. Echoes of gunfire bounced between the rock walls, louder than in the forest. The ambush had worked, but the silence afterward was worse. No more soldiers appeared. Minutes passed. Mercer understood what it meant. The enemy was reassessing. They would not rush again. Instead, they would reposition along the rim and move parallel to the ravine, keeping the patrol trapped below. Hayes realized it too. "They're hurting us." Mercer nodded. "Yes. They know we can't climb out easily. They'll follow above and wait for us to make a mistake." That meant the patrol was not escaping, only relocating the trap. Ellison shifted painfully. "Sarge, my ankle." Mercer looked, not broken but badly sprained. The young soldier could still walk, though slowly. That changed everything. Speed was now impossible. The patrol began moving west along the stream. Every step was cautious. Water muffled their boots but also soaked them, making movement heavier. Overhead, branches cracked periodically, proof the Germans shadowed them from above. Hour by hour, tension replaced adrenaline. No more shots were fired. No voices shouted. The enemy had become patient again. By late afternoon, the forest grew darker beneath thick clouds. The ravine widened slightly, revealing a fallen tree bridging one side to the other. Beyond it, the terrain appeared climbable, but exposed. Mercer studied it. Climbing meant risk. Remaining below meant eventual capture. He turned to the men. "We cross there tonight." Hayes frowned. "They'll expect that." "Yes," Mercer said, "but they also expect us to wait." Night would be their only advantage. Yet Mercer sensed something else. The Germans were no longer simply containing them, they were escorting them, and he had not yet understood why. Darkness did not fall quickly in the forest. It crept in layers, draining color first from the ground, then from the trunks, until only silhouettes remained. Mercer waited until the men could barely distinguish each other's faces before giving the signal to move. Night would hide them, but only if they used it carefully. The fallen tree lay 20 yards ahead, its bark stripped and slick with moisture. Crossing it meant balance, silence, and trust. Beneath it, the stream cut deeper, black water reflecting faint starlight between branches. One slip would not just injure a man, it would make noise. Mercer went first again. He tested each step slowly, weight centered, rifle slung across his back to keep his hands free. The tree flexed slightly beneath him. He paused halfway, listening. No gunfire, no shouts, only distant wind above the ravine. That silence worried him more than bullets ever had. He reached the far side and crouched low, scanning the slope beyond. It was climbable, steep but covered in roots and stone shelves. The others followed one by one. Hayes crossed next, then Ellison, limping but steady with help from another soldier, Carter. The last man, Private Nolan, began carefully across. Halfway through, a sound cut the night. A faint metallic click above. Mercer's stomach tightened. Not a rifle bolt, something smaller, mechanical, deliberate. Then a flare ignited. The sky exploded into white light as it arced overhead, flooding the ravine in sudden brightness. Every shadow vanished, every movement exposed. The Germans had waited for the exact moment when the patrol was most vulnerable, mid-crossing. Gunfire followed instantly. Rounds tore into the tree, splintering wood inches from Nolan's legs. He dropped flat, clinging desperately as fragments struck the water below. Mercer raised his rifle and fired toward the ridge, forcing heads down long enough for Nolan to crawl the remaining distance and fall beside them. "They knew," Hayes said breathlessly. Mercer understood now. The Germans were not guessing their movements. They were predicting them. The patrol's behavior was being studied, anticipated, controlled. And then he realized something else. They had not thrown grenades. At that range, grenades would have ended the patrol immediately. Yet none came, only suppressive rifle fire. "They don't want us dead," Mercer said quietly. Hayes looked at him. "Then what?" Mercer had no answer yet. The flare faded, darkness returning, but the illusion of concealment was gone. The Germans knew exactly where they were. Staying in the ravine no longer mattered. "Up!" Mercer ordered. They began climbing. Mud slid beneath boots, hands grasped roots and rocks, breaths came in controlled silence. No one spoke, no one fired. The Germans above adjusted positions, moving to intercept at the top rather than shoot them during ascent. That confirmed it. They were being guided. The patrol reached the upper ground one by one and immediately moved into dense brush. Mercer changed direction abruptly south instead of west. He needed to break whatever plan the enemy followed. For 20 minutes they walked fast through dark woodland, stumbling but determined. No gunfire followed. No pursuit sounds came close. Only distant movement, always at the edge of hearing. The Germans were matching pace without closing distance. Ellison finally whispered, "Sarge, why don't they finish us?" Mercer stopped, because he finally understood. He studied the terrain, slight elevation, thicker trees, ground drier than the ravine floor, a location with tactical value, not random forest. "They're pushing us somewhere," Mercer said. "Not surrounding, not capturing immediately, driving." He pictured a map in his mind and realized the patrol's path now aligned toward territory recently fought over, a sector where both armies had exchanged control repeatedly. Then the truth formed. They were being moved toward Allied lines. Hayes frowned. "That makes no sense." Mercer shook his head slowly. "It does, if they want us seen." The Germans did not need 6 prisoners. They needed witnesses. And Mercer began to fear what they were meant to witness. Mercer ordered the patrol to halt beneath a cluster of dense fir trees. For the first time since the forest encounter, he knelt and studied the ground instead of the enemy. Tracks crossed the soil, not just theirs. Dozens of boot prints, some days old, others recent. Heavy movement had passed through this area repeatedly. This was not empty woodland. This was a corridor. Hayes crouched beside him. "Supply route?" Mercer shook his head. Too exposed, too close to the front. Then he noticed something else. Deep grooves pressed into the earth, wider than a cartwheel, spaced evenly apart. Not vehicles. Something dragged. Something heavy enough to leave marks but narrow enough to travel under trees. Artillery components. or equipment moved without engines to avoid detection. The Germans were not guiding them randomly. They were steering the patrol toward a location of importance, but still keeping distance, always just far enough behind to influence direction without initiating direct combat. They walked again. Hours passed. The night grew colder. Ellison's limp worsened, yet he refused to slow the others. Each man sensed that stopping now would be worse than exhaustion. Occasionally, distant artillery echoed, but far away, suggesting they were nearing a contested sector. Then the trees thinned. Mercer immediately dropped low, signaling the others to freeze. Ahead, faint shapes appeared through mist, structures, low buildings or bunkers half hidden by terrain. Not a village. Military positions. He raised binoculars carefully. What he saw did not match a normal defensive outpost. The area was quiet. No patrols walking openly. No visible sentries in towers. Instead, camouflage netting covered most of the site. Smoke rose in thin, controlled streams from concealed vents rather than chimneys. A hidden installation. Hayes whispered, "Why bring us here?" Mercer watched longer. Then he saw a small group of German soldiers escorting several figures between buildings. Not soldiers, prisoners, Allied uniforms, but unarmed and guarded. The realization came slowly. This was an interrogation and holding site, and the Germans had maneuvered the patrol close enough to discover it, but not capture them yet. Ellison swallowed. "They want us to report it." "Yes," Mercer said, but reporting meant one thing. They needed the patrol alive long enough to escape. That meant the Germans expected them to run once they understood what they had seen. This was psychological warfare. The enemy wanted Allied command to know the location. Why? Because defending forces might divert resources to destroy it. And where troops moved to attack one position, they weakened another. The patrol was not a target. They were a message. Suddenly a distant shout echoed, not toward them, but from within the compound. Activity increased, vehicles started, orders barked rapidly. The Germans had realized they had been observed. Now they would act differently. "Move," Mercer said sharply. They retreated into the trees immediately. This time the pursuit began without restraint. Branches snapped fast behind them. The careful guiding was over. The patrol had served its purpose. Now they were liabilities. Gunfire cracked through the darkness. Bullets struck trunks near them as they ran. Ellison stumbled, but Hayes dragged him upright. No formation remained. Survival replaced stealth. Mercer led them north, toward the nearest Allied positions he estimated miles away. Exhaustion burned their legs, but stopping meant capture or worse. Dawn began to lighten the sky, and with daylight, concealment would vanish. Behind them, the Germans were no longer patient. They were closing to kill. The first light of dawn filtered weakly through the trees, turning the mist pale grey. Night had protected them, but morning would expose them. Mercer knew they had perhaps an hour before visibility worked entirely against them. The patrol needed distance, fast. They moved uphill through uneven terrain, boots slipping on wet leaves. No one spoke now. Breath was saved for movement. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were unmistakable. Multiple men coordinated, maintaining pressure but not wasting ammunition. The Germans were experienced trackers. Mercer estimated they had already traveled miles since the ravine. Yet the forest seemed endless. Worse, Ellison's condition slowed them more with every step. The young soldier tried to hide it, but his limp had become a stagger. Finally, he stumbled and fell hard. Hayes immediately pulled him up, but Ellison shook his head. "I'm slowing you down. No one gets left," Hayes said firmly. Mercer watched them, weighing reality against instinct. Carrying him would slow everyone. Leaving him meant certain capture. But something else mattered. Morale. The moment one man was abandoned, the others would begin to think survival meant separation. Mercer made a decision. They cut two branches and fashioned a crude support between them. Ellison leaned into it, allowing movement faster than before, though still painful. It was not efficient, but it kept the patrol together. Gunfire cracked again behind them, closer now. A round struck a tree inches from Carter's shoulder, splinters cutting his cheek. The Germans had shortened the distance considerably. The forest here was thinner. Soon concealment would end. Mercer scanned ahead and saw open ground. A clearing stretched across their path, perhaps 80 yards wide. Beyond it, the forest resumed, but crossing would mean full exposure. Staying meant the enemy would reach them within minutes. Hayes looked at him. No words were needed. Mercer checked his ammunition, less than 2 magazines left. Everyone else likely similar. They would not win a sustained fight, but they did not need to. We cross fast and keep moving. No stopping on the other side. He waited for the German footsteps to grow louder, close enough that hesitation meant capture anyway. Go! They sprinted. The clearing seemed larger while crossing than from the trees. Grass flattened under their boots as they ran in a staggered line. For 3 seconds nothing happened. Then rifles erupted behind them. Bullets tore into the ground around their feet, kicking dirt into the air. Carter stumbled but recovered. Ellison nearly fell, held upright by Hayes. Mercer ran last, firing short, controlled shots backward while moving to disrupt aim. Halfway across, a bullet struck Nolan in the leg. He collapsed with a cry, rolling onto his side. Mercer immediately turned back, grabbing his harness and dragging him forward while still firing one-handed. The patrol slowed, but leaving him was impossible. They reached the opposite tree line and dove into cover. Breath came in gasps. Nolan bled heavily, but remained conscious. The wound was serious, yet survivable. If they reached Allied forces soon. Mercer looked behind. German soldiers reached the edge of the clearing, but did not immediately cross. They fired from cover instead, cautious of return fire. The patrol had gained distance again, temporary but valuable. And then Mercer heard it. Not gunfire. Engines. Low, distant mechanical rumbling from ahead. He moved forward carefully through brush until he could see past the trees. In the distance, barely visible through morning haze, stood defensive positions, sandbags, barbed wire, and the distinct outline of Allied helmets moving along a trench line. Friendly lines. They had reached them. Mercer fired 3 rapid shots into the air, a prearranged signal used by patrols returning under pursuit. Moments later, machine guns opened from the Allied position toward the forest behind the patrol. German forces halted and withdrew under the sudden resistance. The chase ended as quickly as it had begun. The patrol collapsed into the trench minutes later, exhausted beyond speech. Medics took Nolan and Ellison immediately. Officers demanded explanations. Mercer could barely speak through exhaustion and cold, but he gave coordinates of the hidden installation. Within hours, artillery was redirected. What the Germans had intended as manipulation became exposure. But as Mercer finally sat in silence, one truth remained clear to him. They had survived not because they had won. They had survived because they had refused to stop moving, even when surrounded. War is often measured by victories and defeats, by captured ground and destroyed equipment. But for the men of Mercer's patrol, survival became its own form of success. No medal could fully describe what they endured in those hours, the silence of the forest, the unseen enemy, and the constant knowledge that every step might be the last. They were never meant to fight a battle that day. They were meant only to observe and return. Instead, they became witnesses to a strategy far larger than themselves and targets within it. Yet what saved them was not superior firepower or reinforcements. It was discipline, trust, and the simple refusal to abandon one another, even when logic said survival would be easier alone. Stories like this rarely appear in official reports. They exist in memories carried long after the war ends. Moments where survival depended not on orders, but on decisions made by ordinary soldiers under impossible pressure. And sometimes the difference between being surrounded and escaping was not strength, but the decision to keep moving forward.